Good to be back here in Norfolk. It's been a while. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Paolo DiGregorio. I'm a historian and archaeologist, and I teach at Bridgewater State University, but I also spend a lot of time talking to people about history. So today we are going to delve into a period of European history that most people aren't that familiar with. It's kind of one of those periods that you tend to skip over in your high school history textbooks. I'm sure you all refer to those all the time, right? Everybody pulls out their high school textbooks. And it's a talk I've called Barbarians, Byzantines, and Moors. And it's a brief history of medieval Europe. Basically, we're going to talk about Europe from the so-called fall of the Roman Empire to about the period of the Crusades. So looking at roughly 500 or 600 years of Western European history, the history of the Mediterranean region. We're going to fly through it pretty quickly, but hopefully you'll hear some names you are familiar with. You will learn a few things along the way. Now, has anybody traveled throughout the Mediterranean? Been to Italy or Spain or France? Or what do you see a lot of when you're in Europe?
Ruins.
Lots of ruins. Lots of ruins. And those are just the newer cities, right? Lots of ruins. You see in Italy, lots of Roman things, right? How about in France? What do you have dotting the countryside in France or in England? Lots of castles, right? Lots of castles. We don't have any good castles here on this side of the Atlantic. So we see Roman ruins and we see medieval castles. Now, what are castles used for? They were defensive structures. They were fortifications. And if you have a lot of castles all over the place, what can you assume is happening? Lots of war, lots of conflict. And in fact, the story we're going to tell today is full of conflict and war and battles and people getting their heads chopped off and all that good stuff. So why don't we just delve right into it? And we will look at the starting point of our story, which is the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was one of the great empires in history. At its height in the 2nd century AD, it controlled the entire Mediterranean region, as you see here on the map. It stretched as far north as Britain, basically southern Scotland. The Romans got that far and then they built a wall. Why? Because the Scots to the north of it were crazy. So they tried to prevent them from coming into the Roman Empire. They built a wall there. All the way to North Africa. As far south as the Sahara Desert. Sahara was big, the Romans didn't want to cross it. All the way out here to the Eastern Mediterranean, the place we today call Israel, Lebanon, Syria, even over here into Mesopotamia, modern day Iraq. That was all part of the Roman Empire during its height, during this period in the 2nd century AD. Now, the Roman Empire does eventually start shrinking. This is the largest extent that it has. But it sticks around. It remains a powerful entity until the 5th century. So for 600 years, there was this thing called Rome, and there was Roman power that dominated the Mediterranean. But what happens in around the year 476? Well, that's when the historians tell us the Roman Empire fell. That is kind of a misleading term, though, because the Roman Empire doesn't really collapse, doesn't really disappear in the 5th century. Now, what we begin to see is a transformation in the Roman Empire. Beginning in around the 2nd century, outside peoples begin migrating into the Roman Empire. The Romans call them the Barbarians. Now today, when you hear the term barbarian, what do you think of? ISIS. Well, you could think of modern terrorist groups, sure. You could think of guys wearing wolf skins and carrying big swords and just beating each other up. And that's kind of a modern perception of the word barbarian. To the Romans, what did the term actually mean? Anybody but them, pretty much. It meant anybody who didn't speak Latin or Greek. If you were from outside of the Greco-Roman world, you were considered a barbarian. You could be the richest, most refined person living up here in Northern Europe. But, you could live in a palace, you could have fine artists working for you, but if you were not Greek, or Latin, you were considered a barbarian. So what do we see happening? But these barbarians, we can call them the Germanic tribes if we want to, coming out of Central Europe, begin crossing the Roman frontier, moving into the Roman Empire. And why do they do that? Well, they need protection. The German tribes, the Germanic tribes that begin to push into the Roman Empire in the 2nd century, going all the way up into the 4th and 5th centuries, were trying to escape other groups that were putting pressure on them. There were groups of fierce nomadic warriors coming out of the east, coming out of what we would today call the steppes of Russia or even Central Asia, that were driving westward, that were putting pressure on these barbarian groups, that were forcing the barbarians to cross into the Roman Empire to seek protection. Perhaps the most well-known and most notorious of those nomadic groups was a group called the Huns. The Huns. And who was the famous leader of the Huns? Attila. Attila was a Hun warlord, a tribal leader who organized his people and leads them on a war of pillaging and conquest, pushing westward. Now, why were the Huns going westward? Well, Rome had wealth. Rome had political power. Rome had population. That's where all the good stuff was. So the Huns, coming out of here, begin moving this way. And you can see the Huns marked here in green on the map. As the Huns are moving west, the other groups that were already living in Central Europe and Eastern Europe are trying to get away from them because the Huns are basically terrible. They are killing and pillaging and doing all sorts of nasty things. So everybody's trying to run away from the Huns, and these other Germanic groups begin taking shelter within the Roman Empire. The Romans have an influx of refugees. Now, the Romans actually embrace much of this refugee population. In fact, many of the German tribesmen who make their way into the Roman Empire are hired by the Romans to defend the frontier. They are equipped, they are trained, and they become the soldiers of the Roman Empire. They're the ones protecting Rome from other groups coming in. Now, Attila and his Huns actually do manage to eventually make their way all the way into the Roman Empire. They do cross the Rhine River over here. They do make their way into Rome. At one point, it looks like Attila is going to attack Rome itself. The Roman emperor is powerless to stop him. The Huns are on a rampage. Nobody's slowing them down. Well, who goes out to defend Rome? The soldiers can't do it. The emperor can't do it. Well, what's the other important institution that's emerging in the late Roman era? But the church. The church. Not quite the Crusades yet, but we're getting there. What we begin to see is the growing importance of the Christian church within the Roman world. Now, Christianity, for the first 2 centuries or so of its existence, 3 centuries of its existence, was illegal in the Roman Empire. Christians were famously persecuted by Nero and Diocletian and other Roman emperors. It isn't until the Emperor Constantine the Great, when he supposedly wins a battle with divine help, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, that Christianity is tolerated within the Roman Empire. It eventually is made the only legal religion within the Roman world. So what you begin to see is that the church is growing in status. Christianity, which had once been an outlaw religion, suddenly has legal standing, and now the leaders of the church are becoming important political and social figures. Now, the Huns invade the Roman Empire. The Roman emperor can't do anything about it. And it is a churchman, a bishop, the Bishop of Milan, who goes out to confront Attila. And he basically convinces Attila not to sack Rome. And in fact, he convinces Attila that maybe you should convert to Christianity. So you have the church beginning to fill a power vacuum in the Roman world. The emperors, particularly in the West, are very weak. The church is beginning to fill that void. Well, the Huns were just one threat to the western part of the Roman Empire. The emperors themselves had actually divided the empire into 2 parts, an Eastern Empire and a Western Empire, for administrative purposes. And there was an emperor in Rome, and there was an emperor in the new city established by Constantine, city that he names after himself, Constantinople. So you had 2 emperors ruling the 2 halves of the Roman Empire. When in the late 5th century, more invasions occur in the Roman Empire. more barbarian groups begin to march into the western part of the Roman Empire. It is the weak Western emperors that are eventually overwhelmed. And in fact, in approximately 476, the last Western Roman Empire emperor is defeated in battle. And that day is sometimes called the fall of the Roman Empire. And as I mentioned, it is a misnomer because the empire doesn't fall. In the West, it basically collapses. You have these other kingdoms that arise in its wake. But in the East, the Roman Empire goes on. It is now centered here in Constantinople. The Eastern Roman Empire will exist for another 1,000 years until the 15th century, when it's eventually overrun by the Ottoman Turks in 1453. So the idea of the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century talks about the collapse of imperial power in the West. But even though the emperor was no longer in charge in the West, the legacy of Rome still played a large role in shaping what would emerge in these Western kingdoms. In any case, by the 5th century, we see imperial power gone in the West. It has disappeared. And it's replaced by the rise of a lot of smaller so-called barbarian or Germanic kingdoms. You have groups like the Ostrogoths who make their way into Italy and eventually take over Italy. The Ostrogoths are led by a guy named Odoacer, who establishes his dominion over Italy. There are the Franks who come into what is today northern France. They give their name to that country. You have groups like the Visigoths who make their way into Spain. The Ostrogoths, the plain old regular Goths. You have the Vandals who go through Spain and end up in North Africa. All of these different barbarian groups had come out of Central Europe, had penetrated the borders of the Roman Empire, and had begun to establish their own dominions, their own kingdoms within the shell that was the Roman Empire. Other groups coming out of what is today Denmark and Scandinavia begin to migrate over to Britain. People like the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes established their own states on the British Isles. Now, these guys were outside of the Roman Empire always. The Romans never extended their dominion that far north. But they were influenced by Rome. The culture of Rome, the idea of Rome did penetrate into the northern reaches of Europe. So what we see by the beginning of the 6th century is a Europe that's transformed, a Mediterranean world that's transformed. The Western Roman Empire has been replaced by a lot of smaller states, these smaller kingdoms dominated by the Germanic tribes, and the Eastern Roman Empire maintaining the traditions, the position, the power of Rome remains. Now, the Eastern Roman Empire eventually acquires a new name, becomes known as the Byzantine Empire. And that's because the site where Constantinople was built had originally been an ancient city called Byzantium. So you have Constantine building a new city on top of an old city. The Eastern Roman Empire centered on Constantinople, but that Eastern Roman Empire becoming known as the Byzantine Empire. Is that Byzantine enough for you? Kind of lots of different hallways to go down there. In any case, this was the situation at the end of the 5th century, the beginning of the 6th century, political transformation across Europe. Now, in the West, over here, as you could imagine, as you have all of these new kingdoms and states and rulers emerging, everybody's vying for power. Everybody's trying to cement their position. And all of those Germanic rulers begin to adopt the trappings of the Roman Empire. Rome had always represented power, had always represented authority. The Roman emperors were representatives of seemingly unlimited power. So when Odoacer conquers Italy, one of the first things he does is he begins dressing and carrying himself like a Roman emperor. When the Franks begin establishing their kingdoms, they begin to emulate what in their mind a Roman emperor did. The idea of Rome was still very powerful among these Germanic tribes. Now, political power in Rome had disappeared with the last emperor, but Rome was still the center of religion. So as the emperors grew weaker toward the end of the empire, those church leaders grew more powerful. And eventually the Bishop of Rome becomes one of the leading figures in Christendom, in the Western Church, in Italy and in Western Europe. So you have this kind of complex relationship that's emerging. The Western Roman Empire is gone, all of these Germanic kingdoms emerging, but the idea of Rome still very strong, and the religion of Rome still very strong. Now, what did that mean? What did that mean? It meant that many of those Germanic rulers that begin to adopt the trappings of empire soon begin to adopt the religion of empire. They begin to put aside their traditional religious beliefs, their paganism, and be swayed by the teachings of various Christian missionaries. So you begin to see a growing influence of the church into those Germanic tribes. Now, perhaps the most significant figure in this transition of power is a guy named Clovis. Anybody heard of Clovis? Clovis was a tribal chieftain among the Franks. He was of that group that penetrates into what was the Roman province of Gaul, modern-day France. And Clovis is historically significant because he manages to unite all of the Franks under his power. He becomes the first king of the Franks and establishes the kingdom of the Franks, what we would today call France. In fact, what is the German word for France? Anybody speak German? It's Frankreich, Kingdom of the Franks, a name that goes back to the 5th and 6th centuries. So Clovis manages to unify his people, assumes the kingship of the Franks, but he also undergoes a religious transformation. When he gains power, he is a typical Frank practicing his religious paganism. His wife, a woman named Clotilde, however, had converted to Christianity. And when Clovis becomes king, his wife basically convinces him that he too should be Christian. He should adopt Christianity. Now, why? Because that will legitimize his power. It would tie his position as king of the Franks, ruler over this new kingdom, to the tradition of the Roman Empire. So Clovis, listening to his wife, she probably had to tell him 3,000 or 4,000 times, but in any case, eventually Clovis does adopt Christianity. He does get baptized. He becomes a Christian king of the Franks. Now, two important things about that. One is that Clovis is baptized by a representative of the Roman Church, what we would today call Roman Catholicism. There were other flavors, other varieties of Christianity circulating around Europe at this time that had different ideas about things like the divinity of Christ and, the structure of the worship service and that sort of thing. Things that we today might think are esoteric, at that time were causes for war. So Clovis is baptized into the Roman religion, the Roman aspect of Christianity. He ties himself directly to the Roman Church. Now, that's important because it gives a boost to Roman Catholicism, essentially. It's also significant that Clovis gets baptized because he then insists that all of his followers be baptized in the Roman tradition. So what happens is Clovis unifies the Franks, Christianizes the Franks, and establishes a Roman Christian kingdom in northwestern Europe, what would eventually become the origin of modern-day France, is established here in the late 5th and early 6th century. What is the predominant Christian denomination in France today? Catholicism. It's a tie that goes back centuries, millennia, back to this episode here with the conversion of Clovis. So you begin to see closer ties between various kings, various barbarian kings, Germanic kings, and the Roman Church. Now, at the same time that this is going on, the church itself is kind of undergoing a transformation. Again, I mentioned there were different varieties of Christianity. There were different ideas about what it meant to be Christian. And a lot of negotiation had to take place. There were even disputes about what is actually the Bible. What books belong in it? What books don't belong in it? What do we actually believe as Christians? You're 5 centuries into this religious tradition at this point, and it becomes kind of fuzzy. So the Roman Church begins to undergo a process of transformation, a process of solidifying its ideology, and a process of aggressive growth. And churchmen, religious figures emerge that are important for this development and really the kind of cementing of power of the Roman Church. One of the important figures to emerge in the 6th century was Benedict of Nursia. Nursia is a city in Italy. Benedict is significant because he establishes the practice of monasticism in Western Europe. He begins to establish the first monasteries. He creates the first bunch of Christian monks in Europe. The tradition of monasticism actually goes back to ancient Egypt and some of the earliest Christians in Egypt and in places like Ethiopia. But it's Benedict who introduces this practice into Western Europe. Now, what do monks do? Why is monasticism important? Anybody? Nobody here's a monk. What do monks do? Well, they remove themselves from society. Society was seen as full of temptation and full of sin. They remove themselves from the cities. They live in isolation in the countryside, and they meditate. They think about religion. They pray and they work. So what Benedict does is he attempts to purify the religion. He creates a core that is removing itself physically from the sins of society and also trying to spiritually cleanse itself from the sins of society. Monasticism becomes an important aspect of Western Christianity during the Middle Ages. Monasteries begin to spring up across Western Europe, Italy, Spain, France, Germany, even as far away as Britain and Ireland. Who's the great patron saint of Ireland? St. Patrick. He is one of these missionary monks that goes out and preaches, and in the wake of St. Patrick, we see monasteries being established across Ireland. The monasteries themselves become centers of scholarship. The monks are reading and preserving the ancient Roman texts. They are trying to go back to the sources of the religion to find the true meaning of it. All of that stems back to Benedict. He's eventually sainted. The other important figure, or another of the important figures, is Pope Gregory I, who also is later on sainted. Gregory begins the push from the Roman Church to send missionaries out to the far reaches of Europe. It's under Gregory that we see some of the first missionaries making their way to the British Isles to spread Christianity, going across into Central Europe to spread Roman Christianity. That becomes tremendously important for the growth and the influence of the religion itself. So, as the politics in Western Europe become more complex, we see the church beginning to acquire a central role that it will hold on to at least until the 16th century. The church becomes one of the power players in the West during this period of the early Middle Ages. Meanwhile, in the Eastern Mediterranean, that former Eastern Roman Empire has transformed itself into the Byzantine Empire, centered over here in Constantinople. The Byzantine emperors saw themselves as the direct heirs of Rome. After all, they were part of the Roman Empire. And they, many of them, were very ambitious and had been the center of empire for centuries. It was a city full of monuments and temples and arenas. Constantine wanted the same thing in his new city. So he undertakes a massive building program, turning Constantinople into perhaps the most important city in the Eastern Mediterranean. A city full of temples and palaces and horse racing tracks and theaters and just tremendous wealth and tremendous symbols of power. Here you see an artist's reconstruction of what Constantinople may have looked like early on in its existence. Here is a medieval map showing Constantinople. Constantinople was sited in a tremendously important location. It was located at a body of water that connected the Black Sea with the Mediterranean Sea. Any trade, any traffic that went between those two bodies had to pass by Constantinople. That meant that in terms of trade, it was a natural location. it becomes fabulously wealthy because it controls that body of water, because it is the center of empire. And that wealth was deposited in building monumental structures across the city. Now, like with any empire, there were certain emperors in the East, in Byzantium, that were skilled in leadership, that were gifted. There were certain emperors that were incompetent. During the reign of those that were powerful and efficient, Byzantium grew. One of the important emperors in this early period of the Byzantine Empire was Justinian. This is Justinian here in the middle. He's the one with the halo. Justinian was a man of overarching ambition. He wanted to reestablish the grandeur of the Roman Empire. He undertakes aggressive war to bring back some of the lost provinces under his realm. But he was also a person who cemented the position of the emperor in the Roman world. In the West, there was always a dispute about who had more power. Was it the emperor or the king or the pope, the leaders of the church? We kind of see that playing out in the West. In the East, there was no question of who was in charge. The emperor was the one with the power. The emperor controlled the secular, these guys over here, his warriors and his officials. But the emperor also controlled the spiritual, the churches and the bishops of the East. All of those people received their position because of the emperor. So Justinian really cements that position. He solidifies the emperor as the center of Byzantine society. He also undertakes a modernization program of Constantinople. At this point, the city itself was more than 200 years old. Some things were falling apart. Some things needed to be replaced. So he undertakes a massive rebuilding project. He also builds one of the great churches in Constantinople, the Church of the Hagia Sophia, which I'll show you in a second. Another important aspect of Justinian's reign is that he brought in scholars from all around the Mediterranean to collect all the written Roman documents, law documents that he could find, to basically put them all in one place. He created a work that was called the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, which was basically a compendium of all Roman legal tradition going back to the earliest dates of the Roman Republic. He basically made a Cliff Notes version of Roman law. That is important because he used that as a means of not only creating law and order within his empire, but it would become the foundation of Western legal systems up to the current day. Much of our modern legal system is based on some of the legal ideas that were established during the Roman Republic and during the Roman Empire that were preserved because of Justinian and the creation of the Corpus Juris Civilis. It was a monumental task to bring all of this together, but it was monumental in its impact. We still deal with the legacy of it today. And as I said, he also waged war to extend the borders of his empire to bring much of the Mediterranean under his control. Now, one of the magnificent structures that was constructed during Justinian's reign was the Church of the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. Justinian wanted to build the largest church in Christendom. So he got the finest builders and architects to design a monumental structure that symbolized not only his piety, but also his power. What we see here is the Hagia Sophia. When it was originally constructed, the minarets were not there. The minarets are added in the 15th century. And it had a tremendously large main prayer hall, which you can kind of see over here. You see some people there for scale. It was a structure unlike anything else that had been built. It was really one of the finest structures of the Roman world. And it is, even today, a awe-inspiring building. Has anybody been to Constantinople?
Istanbul.
Yeah, Istanbul today, right.
How long did it take for them to build it?
It was completed in 535. So it took decades to really get the entire thing up. But it was, and still is, really one of the the showpieces of Western architecture. This structure would go on to influence countless generations of church building and even the building of mosques. When the Ottoman Turks finally conquer Constantinople in the 15th century and they begin building their mosques around the city, they emulate the design of the Hagia Sophia. So it really is one of the great structures in Western art. And it was a symbol of the power and the devotion of the Emperor Justinian, exemplifying his desire to kind of build on the Roman tradition to showcase his influence and his prestige. As I said, he also waged war to extend his empire, and he was pretty successful. He does manage to conquer much of North Africa, and he even manages to bring parts of Italy back under his realm. But those gains were relatively short-lived. After Justinian, a succession of less effective emperors lose the territory, and we see the reestablishment of Western European kingdoms and North African kingdoms in that territory that had been at one time brought under Justinian's reign. Now, part of the problem that the Byzantines faced in this attempt to recreate the Roman Empire wasn't just that they were waging war in the West, but they also faced war in the East. Over here, in the area of southern Mesopotamia and modern-day Iran, there was a Persian Empire that was still a powerful force. One of the reasons why the Romans never really pushed further east from Mesopotamia is because the Persians were there. And the Persians were a fierce, proud, imperial people. So the Romans had border conflicts with the Persians. When the Byzantines are trying to extend their power, they too are facing warfare against the Persians over here in the east. So you had constant warfare on the fringes of the Byzantine Empire. That constant warfare would eventually begin to erode the power, the wealth of the Byzantine Empire. And what we begin to see is that Byzantium itself, this Eastern Roman Empire, will, over the next few centuries, begin to contract. It will begin to grow smaller. As it is unable to defend its extended borders, the territory itself begins to shrink. In fact, by the 15th century, right at the end of the Byzantine Empire, the only thing that remained of Byzantium was an area around Constantinople. So what had once been an empire that stretched across the Mediterranean is reduced to a very small holding 700 years later. So we see this conflict in the 6th and 7th centuries. And this is important because it now draws our attention to a region over here that's not colored in. The Arabian Peninsula. Nobody waged war over the Arabian Peninsula. None of the mighty empires from the ancient world went into Arabia. Why not? What was there? Nothing. It was desert. Why would the Romans want to extend their influence into a region that nobody lived in and there was nothing useful there? If only they knew what was discovered, 2,000 years later, but that's a different story. Why would the Persians want to wage war and waste their time there? Nobody did. And it's in Arabia, however, that the next chapter in our story really emerges. And it has to do with the emergence of a new religion. The religion of Islam. Now, we all are kind of familiar, at least with what we think Islam is all about. But how many of you know the origin stories of the religion itself? It emerges out of this area over here on the Western Arabian Peninsula. And the central figure in the emergence of this religion was a man named Muhammad. Muhammad came from a merchant family. His family were traders. They conducted trans-desert trade on the Arabian Peninsula. But he was orphaned as a relatively young man. Now, Muhammad was lucky because he does marry into a relatively well-to-do merchant family in the city of Mecca. And his wife's family, they're prosperous, so he's doing okay. He kind of moves into the family business. But Muhammad begins to be disenchanted with his occupation and begins to wander out into the desert. And it is there in the desert, while he is meditating, that he begins to have visions. He begins to see things and hear things. And as the story of the creation of Islam goes, that Muhammad in the desert is beginning to receive revelations from God. God is talking to Muhammad through the agency of an angel. Angel Gabriel, right there, Gabriel, is bringing to Muhammad the word of God. God wants Muhammad to create a new faith, a new religion. So Muhammad receives this revelation and then begins to preach it. He begins to preach it to his family. He begins to preach it to his neighbors. And at first, he has very little success in spreading this religion. Part of the problem that Muhammad faces is that the religion that he was preaching was one that was very strict. Some of the key points of Muhammad's revelations are here. One was that there was only one God. It was a monotheistic religion that Muhammad was preaching. The one God's name was Allah. Now, prior to this, most of the inhabitants of the Arabian Peninsula were polytheistic. They had lots of gods. They worshipped idols. The idea of completely changing your belief system was difficult for many of them to comprehend. So Muhammad is basically preaching and nobody's listening. Another aspect of the revelation was that Allah would bring judgment on the world. This one God would judge the good and the bad. He would separate the good from the bad. And that we would each receive our just rewards depending on what we did in this life. Now, these revelations are eventually collected and written down in what becomes the holy book of Islam, the Quran. So Muhammad receives these revelations, begins preaching them, doesn't find a lot of success. He does manage to convert his wife's family. They begin following him, but he meets a lot of resistance from his neighbors in Mecca. So much so that he is eventually forced to flee the city. In 622, Muhammad is chased out of Mecca, and he goes to a neighboring city, the city of Medina, an event that is called the Hijrah. And here we see Muhammad fleeing, basically saving his life by running away from the violence threatened against him in Mecca, goes to Medina. In Medina, he finds a much more receptive audience. He begins to preach, he begins to acquire followers. And in 631, with his followers in tow, Muhammad leads an army against his hometown, against Mecca. He conquers the city, goes into the holy places in Mecca and begins destroying the stone idols that were there. And basically creating an Islamic state in Mecca and Medina. From there, Muhammad's followers begin to fan out. They begin to spread to other parts of the world and they begin to conquer much of the Arabian Peninsula, pushing north into territory that was part of the Byzantine Empire, pushing westward across the rim of North Africa. I'll show you a map of that in a second. So you see this religion that's established on the Arabian Peninsula that begins to grow. It begins to grow because of the preaching of Muhammad and the conquests led by his followers. Now, recently, in the modern press, there has been some controversy about portrayals of the Prophet Muhammad. There is this idea that it is against the religion to show a depiction of Muhammad. And in fact, if you look at this image over here, Muhammad's face is not depicted here. It's kind of blanked out. That tradition is a relatively recent one in the story of Islam. And in fact, there are many depictions of Muhammad from the early Islamic period. The Persians themselves never really followed that belief that you couldn't depict the prophet. But even in other parts of the Islamic world, there were pictures of Muhammad that were created. This one is one of my favorites because it shows three holy men all in the same image. It shows Muhammad over here, seated on a camel, riding next to Jesus, seated on a donkey. Now, Jesus plays a large role in the Quran. Jesus is viewed as a prophet by many Muslims. But unlike in Christianity, where he's viewed as the Son of God, to Muslims, he was just another important prophet. And then over here, you have the prophet Isaiah within the city. So you see this image of Muhammad riding with Jesus, going to visit the prophet Isaiah. Kind of the three main religions of the region: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all depicted in this one image. And what's important about those three religions is that they all come from the same family tree. They all view themselves as descendants of the patriarch Abraham, and they all have similar foundation stories. It's basically the differences come from at what point you view the founder of your religion emerging. You know, with Christians, it's with Jesus; with Muslims, it's with Muhammad 6 centuries later. So you have this commonality of religious origin kind of depicted here in this image. Now, as I said, Islam begins a process of tremendous growth. Muhammad dies in 632, and by the time of his death, his followers basically control the western part of the Arabian Peninsula. But soon they begin to push northward and westward, and they conquer much of North Africa. The religion spreads into the Persian Empire, where it becomes a dominant religion, as it is today in modern-day Iran. And you see this spread of Islam all the way into southwestern Europe, over here in modern-day Spain and Portugal. Islamic warriors, the Moors, North African Arabs, make their way into the Iberian Peninsula and eventually establish a caliphate there. So what we see is the spread of this religion. In 661, a caliphate is established based in the city of Damascus. This is what Damascus looks like, or looked like, before the current civil war. Damascus in modern-day Syria over there becomes the center of the Islamic world. It is from there that the caliphs, and caliphs were considered to be the successors to Muhammad, the leaders of the religious body, were establishing their religious hold over that vast area you see depicted in green. The Umayyad Caliphate will last for about 90 years. But one of the important things that happens during this period is that you do see an Islamic Caliphate established here in modern-day Spain. That Iberian Caliphate is centered at the city of Cordoba, and it becomes kind of a jumping-off point for the expansion of Islam into Europe. From Spain, we see Islamic armies pushing further and further into Europe. Now that causes a crisis in Europe itself, particularly for Christian Europe, for those kings of the Franks over here, for the church in Rome, and even for those Byzantine emperors, because now they face an existential threat from this new faith, this new religion that is rapidly expanding. Well, in the 8th century, a climactic battle is fought in northern France, northwestern France, at Tours. The Battle of Tours in 1732 was a fight between Moorish armies, Islamic armies coming out of Spain, pushing into Europe, and Christian armies led by the Franks going to combat, to stop this Moorish expansion. At the Battle of Tours, the leader of the Franks, a guy named Charles Martel, his name translates to Charles the Hammer, defeats the Moors and stops that Islamic advance into Western Europe. Tours, the Battle of Tours, is essentially one of the battles that saves Christian Europe during the Middle Ages from coming under the power of the Umayyad Caliphate. This is a 19th century painting depicting the Battle of Tours. This guy here is Charles Martel. And what I've always found intriguing about this painting is that right here in the middle of all of this military chaos is a woman cradling a baby. It seems like a bad place to be. In any case, The Battle of Tours is significant because Charles Martel does stop the Moors. There's a little rhyme about it, actually. Charles Martel stops the Moors at Tours. And it was the furthest expanse that Islam makes into Western Europe. And in fact, from the 8th century, going up into the 15th century, we begin to see Christian monarchs on the Iberian Peninsula waging a war against the Caliphate on the Iberian Peninsula. That war is called the Reconquista, and it eventually comes to a culmination in the late 15th century, in the year 1492, when the King and Queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, finally capture the last Moorish stronghold in Spain. Of course, why do we know Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492? They have some time when they're done fighting this war, so they send a guy named Columbus out into the ocean, and that's how we got here. But that's a different story. So the Battle of Tours, significant because it saves Western Europe, and it also eventually leads to the downfall of the Umayyad Caliphate. In fact, in 750, the Umayyads are defeated by the Abbasids. And you have the establishment of the Abbasid Caliphate. Now, the Abbasids move their capital city away from Syria, and they move it to a new city on the banks of the Tigris River, city that they call Baghdad. Here is a depiction of Baghdad during the Abbasid Caliphate. During the Abbasid period, a reign that lasts some 500 years, Baghdad will become essentially the center of the world. It will become one of the most advanced cities, one of the most celebrated cities anywhere on earth. It becomes a place of tremendous wealth, of tremendous artistry, of tremendous knowledge. There are universities and libraries that are established there. It's kind of a far cry from what we think of when we think of Baghdad today. But at that time, it was one of the most important cities in the world. So in any case, the Abbasids do eventually establish their dominion over this Muslim realm. Now, this caliphate, the rise of Islam and Muslim power, is significant. It plays an important role in the story of the West because it becomes a rival with Christianity, a rival with the West. And what we begin to see emerging by the 8th century is at times a life and death struggle between East and West and between Christianity and Islam. The legacy of this struggle is one that we still deal with today. And we'll get to that a little bit later on. In any case, this is going on in the Middle East. Meanwhile, back in France, there is a political upheaval going on. The dynasty that was established by Clovis was a dynasty called the Merovingian dynasty. The Merovingians would rule over France for a couple hundred years. Eventually, however, the family of Charles Martel, the Carolingians, would be gaining influence and power. And in fact, after the Battle of Tours, the Carolingians were really on the rise, and the power of the Merovingians was on the decline. You should write this down. There's going to be a test on this. Eventually, in the late 8th century, the Carolingians overthrow the Merovingians. And what you have is this scene over here, where the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, is deposed by the first Carolingian king, Pippin. This is important because it is a political shift in France. The French kings, a new dynasty of French kings, are still allied with the Roman Church. After all, they're all Roman Christians. But you have a domestic power change. And it's especially significant because one of the Carolingians would rise to a position of unprecedented power, something that Western Europe had not seen since the fall of the Roman Empire. That guy's name was Charlemagne. Charlemagne becomes the king of the Franks after this transfer of power. And he would go on to extend his dominion, not only over all of France, but he would push eastward into Central Europe and southward into northern Italy, eventually becoming the most powerful man in Western Europe. To the south over here, he is kind of involved in protecting Europe from the incursions of the Moors. Over here, he is busy protecting his realms from some of the nomadic peoples that are still in Eastern Europe. So he is seen in many ways as kind of the defender of Western Christendom during this period. And he becomes tremendously powerful, tremendously wealthy. So much so, in fact, that the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, wants to create a new title for Charlemagne. Charlemagne is the king of the Franks. But the Pope says, you know what, why don't I call you a Roman emperor? I'll give you the title of Holy Roman Emperor and I'll give you a crown. And Charlemagne is kind of like, that's a nice title, but I don't know if I want you to do that. Because if you give me a crown and I accept that crown, then who has the power in this relationship? Is it me, the warrior king, or is it you, the Pope, who gave me my title? And that becomes a big issue in the story of politics in the West. Is it church or state that authority, ultimate authority, lies in? So Charlemagne is hesitant to accept this crown. But the Pope, as the story goes, is kind of sneaky. And on Christmas Day, in the year 800, while Charlemagne is deep in prayer, the story is that the Pope basically sneaks into the church, tiptoes up behind him, and drops a crown on his head and says, "You're the Holy Roman Emperor." That's the legend. It probably didn't actually happen like that. Eventually, on Christmas Day, 800, Charlemagne is crowned Holy Roman Emperor, a powerful title, hearkening directly back to those emperors of antiquity. But the crowning of Charlemagne as Holy Roman Emperor also has bigger political ramifications, because over in Constantinople, you had a guy who already claimed the title Roman Emperor. Those descendants of Rome, the last remnants of the Roman Empire. So now you have a Roman emperor in the West and a Roman emperor in the East, and they don't like each other. The Roman emperor in the East thinks that Charlemagne is a pretender, doesn't have a right to that title. And the Roman emperor in the East thinks that the Bishop of Rome doesn't have the power to grant that title. So we're beginning to see political division and religious division between East and West in Europe itself. Though they are both Christian, they're beginning to develop different opinions of Christianity. In any case, Charlemagne does manage to create this vast empire in Western Europe, becomes a tremendously powerful monarch. When he dies, the title of Holy Roman Emperor goes to his son, Louis the Pious. That's Louis over there. And when Louis dies, we have a problem, because Louis has 3 sons. And the 3 sons begin fighting amongst themselves over who should become the next ruler of this territory. Now, traditionally, in the Germanic tradition, when a man died, his property was divided up amongst his sons, which is great, except several generations down the line, it means nobody has anything because everything's been divided up. And that was the problem that was faced here. What do we do with this empire? Well, the 3 sons begin fighting amongst themselves. They are waging war against each other. Charles and Lothair and Louis are waging war. They want to have control of this vast territory. Eventually, however, in 843, the 3 brothers sign a treaty, the Treaty of Verdun. Verdun's a city that's in eastern France now. And by the Treaty of Verdun, they divide the kingdom into 3 parts. Charles becomes the king of the western part of that. He was known as Charles the Bald. Louis the German, takes over the eastern part of that empire. And the middle part, including northern Italy, goes to the 3rd brother, Lothair. Now, this treaty will have long historical impact, because as we move forward in time, the French on one side and the Germans on the other side didn't necessarily get along, and they often waged war. And what were they waging war over? But this territory in the middle. In fact, if you look at things like the Franco-Prussian War of the 1870s, or even World War I, where was the battleground for much of that war but this middle territory between Germany and France? So there are long impacts to this Treaty of Verdun. In any case, Charlemagne's empire is dissolved. Western Europe is divided into these three realms. That structural weakness is important because it happens at about the same time that other outside groups begin pushing into Western Europe. Groups like the Vikings coming out of Scandinavia. We all know the Vikings, right? They're a decent football team in Minnesota. The Magyars, or the Hungarians, coming out of the area from the Black Sea. And those Muslims coming off of North Africa and attacking Sicily and southern Italy. So in the 9th and 10th centuries, Europe is divided and invaded by many outside groups. There is that structural weakness in the West. Now, perhaps the most famous and notorious of these groups is, of course, the Vikings. The Vikings, who we all know went into battle wearing these big horn helmets, right? No, they didn't. That's purely false. That's an idea that was conjured up by opera producers in the 19th century, Wagnerian opera. The Vikings were fierce warriors, but they leave their Scandinavian homeland not at first because of desire, but because of necessity. There's population growth in Scandinavia, but the land isn't growing. So they have to send their young men off to find more land. And those young men take battle axes and swords with them and basically begin killing everybody they run into. But the Vikings do become an important shaper of Western European history. Now, they were fearless in battle. And their fury, the idea of the Vikings inspired fear throughout Western Europe. So much so that many monasteries had prayers, such as this one, for protection from the Vikings. From the fury of the Northmen, deliver us, O Lord. The Northmen were the Vikings coming out of the north. So the Vikings begin a process beginning in about the 9th century and really going until about the 12th century of expansion and sending voyagers out to either acquire territory or acquire riches or just go and explore to see what was out there. Now, the presence of the Vikings and the Viking raids along the coast of Britain would have a profound impact. Britain itself was divided up into many small kingdoms, such as you see here, Northumbria and Mercia and Wessex and all that sort of stuff. Petty kings waging war against each other. Then you throw the Vikings into the mix, and now you have internal strife in Britain and this external threat. That was a very bad situation for Britain. Eventually, out of that mess, one figure emerges to unify the various British kingdoms into one Kingdom of England. And that's a guy named Alfred the Great, who manages to unify these various states under his control. And by unifying England under one king, is able to defend the kingdom somewhat effectively against the Vikings and against those Norsemen raiding his kingdom. So in the 9th century, Alfred becomes the first king of a united England. And what we see from Alfred is basically a relatively unbroken continuum of one monarch ruling over Britain, over England, until the 21st century. So the English monarchy of today is very much a legacy of Alfred the Great in the 9th century and the Viking Wars. Now, while the Vikings were going around and causing this turmoil in Britain, in Central Europe, the Magyars, the Hungarians, were causing a threat to the stability of Italy and Germany. In the 10th century, a guy named Otto becomes the king of the Germans and becomes the leading Christian warrior fighting back against the Magyars, trying to stem this Hungarian attack, this Hungarian invasion into Central Europe. Because of his success in doing that, he is eventually granted Charlemagne's old title of Holy Roman Emperor. And what we see under Otto is the unification of all of Germany, parts of southern France, and much of Italy under his reign. Again, that fragmentation that had occurred after Charlemagne is kind of patched up under Otto. But once again, the Pope grants that title of Holy Roman Emperor, again offending the emperor in Constantinople. That's important. that relationship between East and West is beginning to deteriorate because it will have a protracted impact on Europe. In the West, Mass was conducted in Latin, and the Western churches looked to Rome for instruction, looked to Rome as the center of their religion. In the East, Mass was conducted in Greek, and the Eastern churches looked to Constantinople for their instruction. And the Bishop of Rome and the Bishop of Constantinople often didn't see eye to eye. Not only that, the Bishop of Rome claimed primacy over all of Christianity. They said, we're the leaders of Christianity. And the bishop in Constantinople said, no, we are. And the emperor told us so. So you have this dispute between East and West that is going on. A dispute that in the 11th century comes to a head in a formal division between Eastern Christendom and Western Christendom, an event that comes to be called the Great Schism. The schism is just a fun word to say. But the Great Schism was the formal division of the Christian world between a Roman church and an Eastern Orthodox church. Over here, they spoke in Latin. Over there, they spoke in Greek. And then they had different ideas about certain aspects of the faith itself. Now, why is this important? Well, because you now have Christianity divided in two. And division sometimes makes you vulnerable, right? It's not the best thing for stability. So now Christianity, which had been somewhat monolithic, is broken up. And that means that there will be problems emerging, particularly over here in the East. In the meantime, while this religious division is going on, there are political developments in the West because you have the rise of the Normans. Now, who were the Normans? They eventually become French, but the Normans were actually descendants of those Viking raiders. In the 10th century, Rollo, a Viking warrior, and his followers are occupying a large swath of northern France. And the king of France can't chase them out, can't protect his kingdom from these Viking raiders. He makes an offer to Rollo. He says, hey, Rollo, if you promise not to wage war against me, and in fact, if you promise to become my vassal to help protect France, I will make you a duke. I will make you the Duke of Northern France, an area we can call Normandy. So Rollo, in 911, becomes the first Duke of Normandy. He basically ties himself to the French throne, becomes one of the most important vassals of the French crown. The Normans have been legitimized. They now have legal standing in France. They're no longer these invaders from Scandinavia. They are now Normans in France and defenders of the French kingdom, vassals of the French king. One of Rollo's descendants was another Norman ruler, another Duke of Normandy whose name was William. And William was very happy to be Duke of Normandy, but he had kind of a broader vision. He wanted more. So in 1066, William gathers up his Norman warriors and they row across the English Channel and invade England. The English had been engaged in a bit of civil war. There had been various kings of England fighting for control of England. In 1066, the ruler of England was an Anglo-Saxon king named Harold. Harold had been busy fighting on his northern frontiers against the Scots and some other Viking raiders. And he hears that William has appeared in southern England at a place called Pevensey Bay. So Harold takes his army, marches it all the way across England to run into William's forces outside of Hastings. And there in 1066, a battle is fought, the Battle of Hastings. The Battle of Hastings is tremendously significant in English history because the Normans win. The Anglo-Saxons are defeated. Harold is killed in battle. Here we see him catching an arrow in the eye. And with the Norman victory at Hastings, William begins the process of subduing all of England. And what we see with William is the establishment of a Norman dynasty over England. The Normans will become the power on the island. And they import much of the French language and French government and French ideas into England. William becomes King of England. But William's kind of in an interesting position because he's King of England, but also Duke of Normandy. And as Duke of Normandy, he's a vassal to the French king. But as King of England, he's an equal to the French king. That'll cause problems later down the road. We don't need to get into that today. But you do have that issue at hand. What happens now with the relationship between England and France? It takes about another 1,000 years to finally settle that. But that's a different story, as I said. In any case, the Norman conquest of England establishes William and his followers as the rulers over that island. In the meantime, while the Normans are solidifying their hold over England, there is turmoil in the east. The Byzantine Empire is feeling pressure from the expansion of Islam, from the expansion of a particular group of Muslims, the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuk Turks were a warrior group that had been essentially the fighting arm of the Abbasids. And now the Seljuks are invading Byzantine territory. And in an act of desperation, the Byzantine emperor sends a plea for help to the Pope in the West. He says, look, I know we've had our arguments, but we're all Christians, and now we're being attacked by these Muslims. So why don't you send some help to us to help us fight back against this common enemy? And then maybe we can work out our differences. So in the West, there is this growing desire to maybe help out the Byzantines. In 1095, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, a guy named Urban II, is making a visit to France, and he has received this call for help from the Byzantine Emperor. And Urban II, at Clermont in France, announces a crusade. He says, we must go and rescue the Holy Land, free the Holy Land from these infidels, from these Muslims. We can do this. We will help our brethren in Constantinople push back on this threat. We will recover the holy sites and make them safe for Christian pilgrims. And if you go on crusade and happen to be killed in fighting, well, all of your sins will automatically be forgiven and you get a direct ticket to heaven. So this call for a crusade is met with tremendous enthusiasm. And what we see across Western Europe is knights, young men, children, peasants rallying to the call and making a voyage to the Holy Land. This period of the Crusades would be a dramatic one in Western history. It's often romanticized. A lot of movies have been made about the Crusades and kind of the knights in shining armor and that sort of thing, sort of stuff. A lot of that is very fictional. In 1096, the First Crusade goes off from Europe to go to the Holy Land. They march through the Byzantine Empire. They actually conquer Jerusalem and establish Crusader kingdoms in the East. The First Crusade is the only one that was successful. The Muslims eventually regroup and fight back against the Crusader kingdoms, slowly conquering them. Other crusades are called from Europe to go and again free the Holy Land, but those fail. Eventually, what we see by the time of like the Fourth and the Fifth Crusades is that Christian knights coming out of France, coming out of northern Italy, are going right to Constantinople and sacking Constantinople and taking the treasure from Constantinople and bringing it back to Europe. They don't even go to the Holy Land. Or they go to Egypt and they sack Egypt and bring the treasure from Egypt back to Europe. So the Crusades, which begin as a religious struggle to help Christians in the East and to capture the Holy Land, soon become they're misused, we should say, to pocket the wealthy and to increase the wealth of Western Europe. One city that actually does very well because of the Crusades was the Republic of Venice in northeastern Italy. The Venetians dominated trade in the Eastern Mediterranean, and if you wanted to move an army from Italy to the Holy Land, you hired Venetian ships. And of course, the Venetians had a long-standing rivalry with Constantinople, so they often directed their ships to Constantinople, had the troops on board sack the city. The famous 4 horses in front of St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice were stolen from Constantinople during one of these crusades, and then brought back, to Venice. The patron saint of Venice is St. Mark. St. Mark died in Egypt. The Venetians send men to Egypt to basically steal St. Mark's body from Egypt and bring it back to Venice. So you see all of that going on during this period of the Crusades. Eventually, by the 13th century, the fire of crusading in Western Europe has come to an end, and the period that we would call the Middle Ages is beginning to wind down. The story of Europe in the Middle Ages is a complex one. It's political. It is full of military affairs. It is the rise and fall of religions and the conflict between different ideas about religion. It is a colorful one. It is a dramatic story. And it is one that shapes the modern world that we live in today. So does anybody have any questions? I went a little bit long there, so. All right, thank you.